there a way to, there we go. That was a really interesting talk just before, and I wish I was going to give a talk on uploading or substrate-independent minds so that we could get into a debate about these controversial issues. Actually, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to try to stick to the topic of the conference, which is to talk about writing about the future and how to communicate in a sense. So for the first time, I'm going to try to explain what I do to try to communicate concepts such as substrate-independent minds, the idea of having some really unusual concept that people are not used to, and getting it across and trying to build something on it that would actually turn out to be a project that accomplishes these goals. So let's see how that starts. Now there are two different ways that I could go about it. I could either try to explain this is the history of mind uploading, so this is everything going back to, so I'm just putting up my children as an example, what actually happened throughout the history of mind uploading and who's been involved and all that kind of stuff. Or I could talk about my personal history with it and what have I done, and I chose to do the latter. So let's get into that. How did it all start, first of all, and how do you get into something like that? Well, as it turned out, I like to do a lot of different things, and especially I like to do creative things, and they take a lot of time, they take a lot of effort, and sometimes they're things that we can't even do yet because they're creative things that involve certain skills we don't have or being in places we can't go to. But interestingly, and as a sort of fitting for this conference, getting to substrate-independent minds, to mind uploading, for me did involve books to a large degree. One thing was that at one point in my childhood, I read this book by Arthur C. Clarke, one of the science fiction greats, called The City and the Stars, where he describes a city called Diaspar that has a bunch of inhabitants that take turns living their lives for about 1,000 years and then spending 10,000 years or so in a computer as data, and then being recreated again, and so forth. And the interesting thing is he wrote this back in 1956, and I think that wasn't even his first draft. He had an earlier story that this book was based on. This is a long time ago, especially when you think what the computing world was like at the time, and concepts like this were really outrageous. It also happens that I started writing things, and I wrote a novel once when I was 14, and I never published it because when I did try to contact publishers about it, they said, oh, you can't just talk to us, you need to have an agent or something. And for me at the time, that was like, okay, this goes beyond what I want to do, that's too complicated. So I just left it at that, but hey, you know, I had 400 pages of good story stuff, which eventually I discovered was sort of a fan fiction of Dune, it turned out, but that wasn't my original intent. And the interesting thing is that even in that book, I was writing about substrate-independent minds. I sort of picked up on this notion from Arthur C. Clarke's book, and I was writing about these things that I called matter data processing systems. It's sort of a agglomerate of, say, nanotechnology, something that can build things from the ground up, and minds in computers. And so, for me, the writing and the reading, both of that started me thinking on this, and I started exploring the idea. And I think for a lot of people, that's really one of the most important things to come to any of the topics that we talk about here, is just to have a lot of time to work on those ideas, to think through them, to read things and just explore stuff in your mind. Now, once I had that notion, well, then the question is, how do you go about this? And by the way, I just want to do a quick aside. I didn't even bother to put a slide in here trying to explain to anyone what sin means. So I'm going to do that verbally right now, just because even in this audience, even in San Francisco, there's the possibility that somebody doesn't know what SIM means. SIM stands for substrate-independent minds. It's a newer term, a hopefully more precise but sometimes equally confusing term than the term mind uploading. Mind uploading is this notion that you can take a mind, regard it as a set of functions and data, and that you can transfer all of this somewhere else, so that it can take place somewhere else. So that transfer procedure, we often call mind uploading or mind downloading, side loading, offloading, you name it. There's so many terms for that. But to be more precise, we're trying to point out what is the actual goal of this. Where are you trying to put that? What is it that you are after you do something like a mind upload? what you then are is you are substrate independent, not in that you are not embodied or don't have any kind of matter that you depend on, but just because you can move around from platform to platform. So it's like platform independent code. So that's what that term means. And I've spent a lot of time discussing this and describing it and writing about it and presenting it in various places. So if you need to find out more about it, there's tons of this online. Just look up my name and you'll find a lot of it. But what I really wanted to talk about is, so this idea of doing mind uploading, whether you think it's possible or not, one thing's for sure, it's not easy. It's something that takes a lot of research, a lot of engineering, it takes a lot of money, it takes time. And how do you even start with something like that? You have this huge goal in mind. It could be something else. It could be like flying to a distant star. But you've got this huge goal, like a transhumanist goal. And how do you begin? Where do you begin? How do you keep all these things straight? Well, one thing that happened to me is that I started organizing myself. Basically started keeping track of what things I wanted to do and in which order and what had I done in the past and oh, how did I get to this point and all these sort of things. So basically I was trying to improve my own functioning first. It's kind of an augmentation, and now I like to call it an augmentation too. In fact, I wrote a program that I wrote back in 1999 because I couldn't find anything that would do what I wanted. And I sort of call it a formalizer because it formalizes my thoughts. And I once presented it at a quantified self meeting, and there was quite a bit of interest in it actually, because it does things like keep your schedule straight, but be able to organize it for you automatically if things change, just pop up a new one for you the next day, help you not get tired of what you're doing and go back and forth between tasks and keep track of everything you've done there and log everything that you need to know, all that sort of stuff. So it's just like you have to manage a company or something, you have to manage yourself if you're dealing with big projects. And that inevitably becomes necessary because something complex just goes beyond what you can hold in that little piece of mind that we tend to use to keep our daily tasks straight. So that's important in any case. But where did it all start then? Okay, so there was a period before 1994 where I was sort of just learning about things and going to school and stuff like that. But in 1994, that's when I would say working on mind uploading, working on SIM, what it was eventually called, really began. And this began because, well, I got on the internet. I had an email account and I found a mailing list. And this mailing list belonged to a group by Joe Strout, who had a page called the Mind Uploading homepage, where he listed some basic ideas about what it was and who'd written about it, and maybe even some idea of what to do with it. But when you look at what the state was of this entire concept, of the entire field of what we could call SIM, it was still pretty primitive. The concept itself had a beginning. Okay, we'd like to upload, we're here and we'd like to be there, and it had this end, oh yes, that would be wonderful if we're uploaded, then we can do all these wonderful things, and maybe we can do this by using neuroscience in some way. But there really was no middle. There was no project. There were no real technologies. There wasn't anything together in that sense. Maybe a few inklings of an idea of how you could do it. And then, of course, people like Moravec had already written about some procedures that hypothetically could work if you had some really fantastic machines that also hadn't been developed yet. Then, if you look at who was interested in this, of course there was sci-fi. I mean, we see that Arthur C. Clarke already wrote about it back in 1956. But outside of that, taking it beyond that, saying let's just try to make this happen and pull things together, there probably are quite a few people across the world who would like to do that, who have been doing that since 1994, but that I know of who've come together as a group. This was really small. There were maybe 25 people involved. And the worst part was it was basically impossible to discuss. You couldn't go up to a scientist working in a lab and say, I'd really like to do this mind uploading thing. How do we go about that? And can I do a project here that would help get that there? That just didn't work. I mean, I was a naturally cautious person in that sense, so I didn't immediately overstep my bounds and try that sort of thing. But I did try to always push whatever I was doing in the direction of working on projects that could move this along in some way or another. And so, you start a rapport with scientists. You start to show them that you know what you're doing, and you work on neuroscience projects that work at the level you'd like to work at. For example, you want to build models at the physiological level so that you can learn about how the computations in the brain work. And then you talk to them as well. And you talk to a lot of scientists. You go to conferences, and that begins to help. But it was totally impossible to just bring it up and be taken seriously in 1994. There was no way. So if there's any measure of progress that we can hang on to already, there's definitely that now that is absolutely not the case. Now those same scientists from those same labs are writing books in which they basically say, yeah, we could eventually do this. And I'll get to those in a little bit. So what eventually has to happen if by, say, 2045, to pick a not entirely arbitrary date, we would like to have substrate-independent minds? Well, there's a ton that needs to happen there. You have to have science, obviously. People need to look at the actual problems there. You need engineering. In other words, someone needs to put together tools, especially tools that deal with hard neuroscience problems, like how do you get a whole ton of really high-resolution data out of the brain? And there needs to be some social change. In other words, people need to get used to the concept. They need to get used to the idea. It needs to be talked about. It's not that unusual, strange ideas are necessarily any more unusual or more strange than some of the ideas that are already out there and that everybody talks about all the time. The difference is just that people aren't used to talking about it all the time. I mean, look at all the different belief systems out there, for example. There's certainly some very unusual belief systems, and yet tons of people talk about them and take them seriously and all sorts of stuff. So there's no reason why something that's actually founded in technology and science couldn't be talked about, even if it's really ambitious. It's just that people need to talk about it. It needs to become normal so you don't have this future shock syndrome, but instead feel comfortable talking about all the issues involved. Then there's the matter of funding. Where do you find money for anything like this? This could be just by redirecting what the government likes to fund, or it could be by finding private funders, or maybe doing something entrepreneurial. And then, of course, work needs to be put in, because all the exponential curves aside, somebody has to do all this stuff. And there's also the little matter of directing where that curve goes. Because an exponential curve tells you that something's going to happen fast, but you don't necessarily know what. Then there's a roadmap. Okay, you need to have an actual plan, something that tells you this is the lay of the land, this is where we're trying to get, these are all the different ways you could go there. And a good roadmap, of course, is not something that's written on paper. A good roadmap is something that's alive. It's a dynamic thing. It means you have people who are responsible for maintaining this roadmap, for constantly going through the literature, keeping in touch with labs, keeping in touch with science, making sure that this roadmap develops. And then there are solutions. So you need to find those paths that lead to your goal. So this is a big problem. That means that probably it's not something you can do in your garage by yourself. Then the question is, how do you get other people to listen to you? How do you grow a group of people? Oh, that was fast. Okay. How do you grow a group of people that you want to work with? First of all, you need to be patient, and you need to be able to talk to them about all the challenges while remaining optimistic. You should not necessarily reinvent everything or try to just say, well, the establishment doesn't care about this, so the establishment must be wrong, we have to do everything completely differently, because these people are there for a reason. They're experts that you're going to need. Instead, try to make friends. Build a reputation, become a peer of theirs. It takes some time, because they say it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert in something. And yes, this is going to have an impact on you, because when you don't know anything, everything seems possible, so you're very optimistic, and the more you learn about it, the harder it seems, so you might get pessimistic. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect. But don't let it discourage you. Just become augmented, get one of those tools like that. So there are four main things that a respectable social or technical goal needs to have. It needs to have concepts, it needs to be formalized, it needs to have a practical set of solutions that you can work towards, and a community that represents it. Here's the example of building a moon base and SpaceX involved there. Now, how do you go about that here? In 1994, 1999, the question was really, okay, we have to describe the concept. What is mind uploading? Get from something hazy to good description. I talked about that already. And a method that's actually applicable, whole brain emulation. It's the most conservative approach, the only one that neuroscience currently could handle, because we've only dealt with these really low-level concepts in neuroscience. And then, well, you need to make this organization happen, and I won't go into that right now because I don't have time. But ultimately, and this is just very recent, we've been able to start grounding what's going on in this field in actual science by writing about it in peer-reviewed journals and building the fundamentals, describing what the research is that's taking place, and even having some results, like the Brigman et al. Results in Nature, that kind of give us support that at least some of the basics of how you would approach whole brain emulation are possible as a technical goal. And okay, this is putting together the puzzle. Again, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to get into too much detail here. But as I was saying, now you can see that some of the books that Church and Nicolelis and Sung are coming out with are actually books that are now describing some of the stuff that Arthur C. Clarke was talking about back in 1956. So it's no longer something you can't talk about. It's become respectable enough for science. And I was going to go into overcoming dismissal, and I think I'll end on that because it's actually kind of interesting. So there are lots of different ways you could be dismissed on a big topic such as substrate-independent minds. There's the popular one where people just don't realize it's an actual topic that people are working on. They think this is just science fiction. That's mostly because you haven't gone out there and you haven't talked to people about it. Then there's, even within the crowd, like say in transhumanism here, there are a lot of people who would say, well, first of all, this looks way too complicated. I have no idea where to begin. We're just going to have to make artificial general intelligence first and they'll solve it for us. That's throwing your hands up and saying the problem's too big. Or saying, well, this is going to take 1,000 years. But that's based on what? It's not really based on specifics about what you need to do. It's based on not having enough details, not enough knowledge there, telling you what is the problem and how would you approach it. And that needs to be told, because neuroscientists don't go out there and do a lot of talks, generally speaking. And then finally, well, the scientists themselves. They think that we're just non-experts, and so we don't know what we're talking about. And then the point is to go to them and talk to them at their level. You ask them questions where you show them that you respect their expertise and you're taking them seriously. So I think I'll end on this, how you overcome dismissal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we have time for one question while we're setting up for the next speaker. Is there any question from the audience? Keith, here. Sure.
I'm curious if you've ever read a story I wrote called The Clinic Seed.
No, I'm afraid not.
Well, it's heavily into this particular topic, and it's if you'd like to take a look at it sometime, I could use it may turn into a movie. It's already been turned into a script.
We should chat.
So yeah, we should do that. Anybody else?
Wait.
Question.
Do you think the hard problem of consciousness, do you think consciousness is something that ultimately will be able to say is like dark matter, or a physical, something that will be able to reduce to a physical?
Well, in all honesty, I can't say for sure, of course, because we just don't know. But my feeling so far from just observing what we describe as consciousness versus what we describe as other faculties of the brain, and what we worry about in terms of how to figure out consciousness versus figuring out things like perception, executive functions, motor control, I haven't really seen that we've run into a particular problem where we say, ooh, we've run into a hurdle, we don't know how to do this. We've never been stumped by saying, oh, we couldn't implement this aspect of consciousness yet. In any way more than we've been stumped by these other things. So to me, it's not clear that the problem is fundamentally different. It seems to me that they're being produced by the same types of processes, but that's just my opinion. Yeah.
There's some interesting research going on in England with either near-death experiences that examine some of this. I can't remember the name of it offhand, but maybe we can talk later.
Yeah,
Thanks.
let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Randal.